Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and just release a rant about just a topic that makes me so angry, like ridiculously so, because of how much I see the same BS talking points peddled about the fantasy genre again and again, and not just from people who don't read it, not just from fans, but from authors who write within the genre, and it pisses me off so much because the fantasy genre is, for some reason, if you're not aware, looked down upon. Although I have no idea how you'd be unaware of this due to the incessant repeating of the idea that fantasy is somehow not an adult, sophisticated genre, but is somehow nothing but fairies and farts from dragons and isn't worth any kind of deeper understanding or study because, it's got elves, so it's stupid! And I hate this. I hate this so much. And today we're going to dive into how this idea gets started and perpetuated, and how we as fans can push back against it. And now we have our primo suspect number one, the man we need to blame a lot here, Terry Goodkind. I have not talked about him on the channel in quite some time, because I don't find inflating his ego by saying his name is something I want to partake in. But there's one quote that kind of just sums up this whole debacle from Terry Goodkind in one nice little package. And basically Terry Goodkind is saying, I'm not a fantasy author. That's stupid. I have transcended the genre and am somehow above it. I don't write fantasy. I write something above and beyond. Now, Terry took a break from filleting himself in the forest of his own ego long enough to grace us with these words of wisdom that just are a beautiful little perfecto mundo example of what not to think about the fantasy genre, because this quote, this idea, just demonstrates such a gross misunderstanding of what genre even is, that it's just the perfect dissection. But not all of the guilt lies on this man's shoulders. You're not entirely to blame here. You're just one of the worst contributors. We also have J.K. Rowling and people like her who have somehow backed away saying, no, I'm not a fantasy author. When you wrote a book about f***ing wizards, embrace it. It's okay. And this mentality, I hate to say it, is somewhat loosely understandable because society, and I hate using that word because I sound like some Joker wannabe douche, frowns on us. They frown on fantasy, especially within academic circles. Fantasy is just kind of scoffed at and seen as childish. I'm going to state my side of the debate here as crystal clear as I can. The genre of fantasy in no way, shape, or form limits your story from being a respectable, interesting piece of literature. All fantasy does, the only thing it does as a genre is gives you more tools as an author to work with to explore these ideas in maybe exaggerated or deep metaphorical ways. And anything beyond that is wrong, because no, being a fantasy author does not limit you at all. No, writing fantasy does not mean you're writing stories for kids. Hey, Prince of Thorns, are you for kids? No? Well, look at that! I've used this example to counter this point before, but I'm going to use it again because everyone in the world knows this reference. The Lord of the Rings is one of the best meditations on post-World War I Europe ever written. Tolkien is writing about us when he penned these pages. And the grand message of Lord of the Rings, would you believe it or not, is that humanity is headed down a pretty dark path. We're becoming more disconnected from nature, we're becoming further away from simpler times, and the Industrial Revolution is going to result in some pretty dark stuff. No, he's not saying we shouldn't have things like penicillin, but there's some pretty clear ideas that maybe this mechanical age we're diving head first into without looking to see if there's no diving first signs of the community pool, Tom, is maybe not the best idea. Point A. Point B. Hey, guess what? Tolkien was right, and maybe if we studied Lord of the Rings as the piece of brilliant academic work that it absolutely 100% is, we could have learned some lessons from the man who fought in the Great War and lived to give the Nazis a middle finger because he's a badass and wrote the greatest fantasy story ever told. Okay? That's just one example. We also have tons of other fantasy stories which have beautiful, modern takes on world events. I just got caught up on the Poppy War. The Dragon Republic is an extraordinary reframing of storytelling, basically saying, hey authors, stop focusing on the big picture when it comes to war, and maybe take a couple seconds to think about the victims, the refugees, the little guys who get trounced all over. Something that fantasy is guilty of, but almost every other genre that writes about war is guilty of too. This author is doing an incredible thing for literature, where she's basically turning the spotlight back at other authors and saying, hey, write more about the people who are suffering, please, because you're glorifying the most evil, horrific thing humanity could do, murder one each other en masse. That's a pretty great message to have. Academic circles, oh no, it's fantasy, it's stupid, there's magic, therefore it's not worth paying attention to. And here's the real takeaway from this video. Are you ready? Clench your butts, because you're gonna need to. It's gonna be some earth-shattering shit right here for you. Genre, like the label fantasy, largely a marketing gimmick. Largely just something publishers decide to throw on something or not throw on something to help it sell more. Because guess what? There's a whole lot of books out there that are respected in academic circles that have tons of fantasy elements in them. Loads. But guess what? They weren't marketed as fantasy, so they're not thought about as fantasy, and so they suddenly, because they don't have this arbitrary label a publisher puts on it, they're respected more. You, that's stupid. A great example of this is the entire back catalog of Stephen King. All of his worlds are connected. He's literally making an MCU type scenario. There's a permeating magic system that characters use. Oh, magic, that sounds like something from fantasy. There's fictional creatures that he made up to be a metaphor for some kind of reflection within the characters or our own world. Kind of like, I don't know, orcs are and elves. Jesus Christ, how do people not pick up on this? We have people with supernatural abilities, a devil figure. Are you paying attention here? We also have universe hopping. Basically, Stephen King had things that are inspiring in Marvel Cinematic Universe, which suffers from the same problem where people just write it off as not real cinema because it can't be reflective, let alone the whole arc where maybe Captain America's losing his patriotism while America right now is really struggling with similar ideas. No, can't take that seriously, because there's a hammer that's magic. Anyway, moving on. I want to talk about some more things here. So we have our culprits who perpetuate this idea. We have the worst of the worst. Number one most wanted for me right now, Terry Goodkind. Just, you know how I feel about him. And he so perpetuates this idea, it's awful. He just rips off fantasy authors that came before him, strips away their deeper meanings and metaphorical attributes for what they accomplished just to have some kind of skim light fantasy coating over his works, and he just doesn't write anything worth merit on top of that. Then we have people like J.K. Rowling, who actually wrote good fantasy stories that are worth respect and have some nice themes to them, and use the fantasy genre to elevate their storytelling. But now she's turned her back on us, because she feels like her billions make her better than us. And I don't get it, man. And I guess the real message of this video is to the fans to stand up to people who talk down about this genre, because I'll maintain that the fantasy genre back catalog has some of the most interesting meditations on humanity ever. But also, if you happen to be a fantasy author or someone who has used fantasy elements in their story to craft a work, please show us, the fans, respect, and don't back away once you reach success or talk down to it because your ego's too big to admit that fantasy elements are important to your story. It's okay. It's just a literary tool to elevate your writing and maybe accomplish new things. That's all. And hey, if you just want to write a fantasy story that doesn't have intense metaphors or meditations and theming on this stuff, that's 100% all right too. I'm just talking about the idea that people dismiss fantasy utterly and completely as having any form of academic or respectable worth, because those people have absolutely no idea what they're talking about. And if you're one of these college professors, like a couple of the ones I had, that will actually stop a student from talking in class if they use a fantasy work as a reference for the argument they're making, and tell them that it physically cannot have merit for the argument because it's based in fantasy, you are wrong. Completely and demonstrably closed-doored, stupid, not open to anything in your own echo chamber of bullshit. Wrong. And the people who have crafted these stories you're disrespecting are a million times brighter and are contributing more to intelligent conversations than I promise you are. So that's the end of this rant. I don't know why I used the green screen for it. It feels a bit inappropriate with the tone, but I'll use a lot of funny stuff in the background to make it okay. Maybe make it seem like I'm not as angry as I am for this video. Like and subscribe if you have not already. Hit the Patreon if you want to support what I do here. And have a good one, y'all. Peace.